So good evening and warm greetings to all of you. Welcome to the 5th lecture under the IHT-ISLE webinar series, that is COVID-19 and its implications for economy, work and livelihoods. I am Priyanka Tyagi, Senior Manager of Program Administration and Communication with Institute for Human Development, which has been established under the aegis of Indian Society of Labour Economics. It also hosts the ISLE Secretariat. The Institute for Human Development and the Indian Society of Labour Economics are delighted that Professor Guy Standing, Professorial Research Associate, SOAS University of London, co-founder and co-president of Basic Income Earth Network and former director of ILO's Social Economic Security Program, will be delivering this lecture titled The Ethical and Economic Case for Basic Income in a Time of Pandemics. A very important issue in present times. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Standing. The webinar is being moderated by Ms. Renana Jhabwala. She's chairperson of Seva Bharat. A warm welcome to you, Ms. Jhabwala. We are grateful to you for agreeing to moderate this lecture. And for me personally, it is indeed a great honor to be sharing screen space with all of you. Before I call upon Professor Alakhen Sharma for the formal welcomes, as I always give numbers in the beginning of the lectures, we are very thankful to all the participants. We've got an overwhelming response to this web lecture, to our invitation. Close to 1,500 people have registered for this webinar. However, as we mentioned in our invitation, we are constrained to only accommodate 500 people, but we are going live on YouTube. All those people who are not being able to join here may kindly move to YouTube. Please log into YouTube and search for IHT India. This is the video that will be playing there. And also the Q&A tab that has been, the toggle that has been opened for the public for all the attendees. After 25-30 minutes of the lecture, we would request you to place your questions only through the Q&A tab, which will help the moderators, and I'm sure the moderator will be able to take up questions from there. And now I would like to call upon the Director of Institute for Human Development, Professor Alakhen Sharma, who is a known labor and development economist who has worked extensively on employment issues in India. He's also the editor of the Society's journal, the Indian Journal of Labor Economics. I request him to formally commence the proceedings of this webinar and introduce the speakers and the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. On behalf of the Institute for Human Development and Indian Society of Labour Economics, I would also like to welcome all those who have joined today's lecture. And I see the number, 300 persons have joined and still joining. And as you said, 1,500 persons have registered for the lecture. The lecture is under the series IHD ISLE lecture series on COVID and its implications for employment, work and livelihood, in which a number of lectures have been given. The last lecture was on 27th by Professor Kaushik Basu, which was moderated by Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. We also organized a major conference, international conference under this series, along with ILO on June 8th and 9th, which was attended by something like 1,000 people. It was really a very huge success, and a special symposium on this is being published in the Indian Journal of Labour Economics. The theme of this lecture is extremely important. The theme, as you know, the ethical and economic case for basic income during pandemics. Income transfer is being done in most of the countries in the times of COVID-19 as a measure to address the vulnerability of the masses, both in developed and developing countries. And there is now renewed interest in this universal basic income. That is why in India also a lot of discussions is taking place, though the discussions have been taking place during the last 3-4 years. But I find that, and in fact, one of the panel in this series was approach to income transfer in COVID-19 in India, in which a panel spoke, Sudipta Mandal and Mahendra Dev and Vinod Thomas. That is why we thought that there should be more discussion on this topic, and I thought to invite Dr. Guy is standing for this. I think most of the people in this audience must be knowing that, but some who may not know, just I would like to tell that Guy is one person globally who has been working on universal basic income during last several years. I can't tell you the exact number, but maybe 2 decades. I have been listening to him. In fact, about 7-8 years back, he also delivered a lecture on this issue in our Indian Society of Labor Economics conference in Banaras 7-8 years back. And that is why I thought that this will be a very interesting and relevant topic, and hence I invited Guy. Thanks, Guy, for accepting our invitation. Friends, Guy is a very well-known development labor economist of global reputation. He is currently professorial fellow in SOAS University of London. For a long time, Guy worked, and where we met and became friends in ILO, and his last assignment was director of the Socio-Economic Security Program. He was heading that. Guy is a PhD from University of Cambridge, and currently he's also fellow of British Academy of Social Sciences. He has also founded the Basic Income Earth Network, and he is the co-president, and he's a member of the Progressive Economic Forum. This is important to note that during 2016-19, he was an economic advisor to Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer in UK. After assignment from ILO, he was also professor at SOAS, Bath University, and Monash University. Guy has authored so many books, and those books have ran into several editions. One of his books, The Precariat, the New Dangerous Class, has been published in 23 languages. And he has also written Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. He has also co-authored a book with Mrs. Renana Jhabwala, Basic Income, a Transformative Policy for India. So who can be better person than Guy to speak on this topic? I am very delighted that we have a equally eminent person in Mrs. Renana Jhabwala to moderate this today's lecture. Mrs. Jhabwala is a well-known social worker who has been active for decades in organizing women in the informal economy, in trade unions, cooperatives, and financial institutions in India. Apart from that, she has been actively engaged in policy issues relating to poor women and informal economy. She is best known for her long association with the Self-Employed Women's Association, SEWA. She is for her services, for her social work. She was also awarded the Padma Shri from the Government of India. She has also been Chancellor of Gandhigram Rural University, and very recently, she has been a member of UN Secretary General High Level Panel on Women's Economic Empowerment. She is currently, of course, as was written in the invitation and told by Priyanka, Chairperson Seva Bharat. Uh, Mrs. Renaz Habwala is also Chairperson, WIGO Board, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, and Chairperson, Homenet South Asia. I won't go into detail, but apart from authoring several books, one of her books is jointly authored with Guy Standing, which is Social Income and Insecurity. She also authored with Mrs. That book was Basic Income, a Transformative Policy for India, co-edited with Sarat Dawla, Soumya Kapoor Mehta, and Guy Standing. So she is very, very eminently suitable and appropriate for moderating this discussion. So I am very happy that an eminent person, an eminent expert is delivering this lecture, and another eminent expert on basic income is moderating discussion. With these words, I thank both of them, and again welcome all of you who have joined this lecture. Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Jawala, we are in your hands.
So, thank you so much, Professor Alak Sharma, and thank you for introducing both of us, and also for setting up this discussion. And I think basic income is a very important issue that needs to be discussed. You had a very good introduction of Guy Standing, and I would just like to add to it that he has the most international experience on basic income. In fact, as far as I know, he has traveled to more places than anyone else I know to talk about basic income and try and promote basic income. But he also has had a very long experience in India. And I know he was doing studies well before I knew him, but I have known him for more than 20 years when he first worked with Seva to do a study on social income. And ever since then, more than 20 years ago, over the last 20 years, he has worked continuously or many times with Seva on different studies. And ever since I have known him 20 years ago, he has been urging us to think about basic income for India. I must say he has been most tireless in this urging because we were totally uninterested. I think for about 10 years, we were uninterested in his urging, and he was so patient. And basic income really has been in the world, and I'm sure he'll talk about it for a very long time. But it has also created a lot of interest in India, but only in the last 10 years. And I think a number of academics have been writing about basic income. Prarab Bardhan, Vijay Joshi, more recently Abhijit Banerjee. And not only just writing, but also the government, the bureaucracy, even politicians have got interested in basic income maybe 10 years ago, less because of the ethical or moral reasons, and more because it is an easy way, or it is an easier way to have social security. And the first signs of basic income really, or the move towards basic income, was a move towards cash transfer, what used to be called, or is still called, the direct benefit transfer. And there has been a lot of advocacy, there has been a lot of work in the government on increasing direct benefit transfers. And as the JAM, the Jandhan Aadhaar card, and what's M? A mobile was increasing. I think the interest in basic income has been increasing, and there are a number of schemes like the Kisan scheme, which is a DBT, a cash transfer, which approximates something like basic income. I'm sure a guy will explain to us more about basic income, but very simply, basic income is universal, it is a regular cash transfer, and it is unconditional. I think I've captured all the essential elements of a basic income. I'd also like to tell us that once it became technically possible in India, Seva with Guy Standing had done what is still the largest study, was the first study and the largest field study on actually doing basic income. We actually gave a basic income to in 12 villages and had a study of 20,000 people to see what was the effect of a basic income. And I must personally say, in spite of all guys' urging, I was not very impressed with the idea of basic income. But when we did this study, which lasted almost 2 years, I completely changed, because the effects of the study, the effects of the basic income, the findings of the study was that, especially among the poorest, basic income can be transformative or is transformative. And it has no negative implications like people seem to think. So we have become something of an advocate also of basic income. And along with Guy Standing and our associate Sarad Davla, had actually founded the Indian network for basic income, known as INBI. And if you would like to know more about that, we'd be happy to tell you about it. I'm very pleased that Guy is going to be talking about basic income in the time of pandemic. It's something, as Professor Alak Sharma mentioned, it's something, our income transfers is something that has proved extremely important during the pandemic. And had we had a basic income or something like a basic income, I think many of the negative effects, the migration of the labor that we saw may not have happened. So I'd like to hand it over to Guy, and we look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you very much, Renana. And I apologize at the beginning because I've got a croaky throat, so I hope to be able to get through this speech. But I would like to dedicate it to Alok, Renana, and Jerry Rogers, 3 people who have kept the flame of labor economics in India going for many, many years. And I would like to pay tribute to the work they have all been doing, complementary work, fantastic work. The lecture I'm going to give is split into several parts, but I think it's very clear. There's one lesson that's become very, very apparent during the course of this pandemic, that the resilience of society, our resilience, will depend on the resilience of the most vulnerable groups in society. Unless all groups are protected and given a sense of resilience, pandemics will roll on, we will have more second rounds and so on, and we will not escape from the slump that has hit the global economy. The second point I want to make is that the costs of the pandemic slump will be higher and will last longer unless we move to something like a basic income system, and I'll come back to that later. Now, my proposition today, and in my work, is that the justification for a basic income system, as I prefer to call it, is fundamentally ethical. But what has happened because of the pandemic is that it is moved from being primarily ethical to being both that and an economic imperative. And I think looking at India and knowing a bit about India and having worked with many Indians over many, many years, I think India could become a global path breaker, path setter, because it has the technology, it has the infrastructure now. And despite its huge size, I think the infrastructure makes it feasible to roll out a basic income system. A second preliminary comment I'd like to make is that if the government, for some reason, feels unable to roll out a basic income nationally now, during this pandemic, I urge them to launch further pilots that will be testing how best to implement a basic income system. With those points put aside, let me just remind us what a basic income is. Renana has already touched on it. Fundamentally, it's the payment of a modest amount in cash or equivalent to each individual, not on a household basis, not on a family basis, but to each individual. It's a vital part. It's unconditional in behavioral terms. Bureaucrats don't tell people what they have to do. It's entirely up to the people who receive it to determine what they can do within the law. It's non-withdrawable. In other words, it's an economic right. And it's quasi-universal. I don't use the term universal because you have to have some restrictions on who is eligible. I would prefer to say that it's for usually resident in the communities. And it's vital that everybody in the community who's a usual resident should receive it. And it's better than all the existing household-based means-tested schemes, which have incredible exclusion errors and tend to rigidify patriarchal structures, tend to rigidify situations where vulnerable members of households remain the most vulnerable. Whereas if an individual, like we saw in our pilots in Madhya Pradesh and West Delhi, if an individual person with disabilities has their suddenly has their individual basic income, they become a full citizen, if you like, in that community. Now, it's very important to appreciate that it's not charity. Unlike many social assistance schemes, it's not a charity, it's an economic right. And I think it's important also to realize that what we're advocating is a basic income system. In other words, you would allow for supplements for people who have extra costs of living, and you would have a multi-tier system of social protection. It would be the base. It is not a panacea, it is merely an anchor of a new income distribution system. Now, before I go into the ethical justification, let me just mention that in this pandemic, we're going to have more pandemics like this one, I believe, the advantages of something like a basic income have to be compared with the other possible options for policies. In India, of course, with Narega, public works of various schemes, has a long tradition. A lot of people have put a lot of their faith and time into advocating them. But in a time of pandemics, they're extremely risky. There is a lot of social contact. You can't have social distancing. And a lot of people with preconditions, as the medical people call it, would be excluded. Note that I'm not saying that a basic income should replace all or most of the existing schemes, although I do have preferences. But it's possible to say you can have a basic income and some of those other schemes. But bear in mind the known disadvantages, huge administration costs of those schemes, huge exclusion errors. When you have means tested, PDS, with cards. We know from generations of research that large percentages of those who should be receiving those benefits, those subsidies, don't actually receive them. And what they do receive is often much less than we would regard as acceptable in terms of quality. And I think the fundamental difference between those who advocate subsidies of that type and a basic income advocate, and I'm being a bit too sharp, but it's a short lecture, so I hope you will forgive me. But the subsidy advocate basically says, we know what you need and we will give you it. The basic income advocate says, I don't know what you need, only you do. But we should provide you with the means of trying to obtain it. That's a difference in a philosophical sense. Now, let me first discuss the ethical foundations. The first is that a basic income is a matter of common justice. The income and wealth of all of us is far more to do with the efforts of many generations before us than anything we do ourselves. And if we allow for the private inheritance of wealth, which is a lot of something for nothing for a minority, then we can see a basic income as a sort of social dividend on the public wealth accumulated throughout history. And I think that's a very important principle. It's strengthened by the fact that over time, in India or in Britain or in any other country, the commons, the resources, the nature, the land, the sea, the water, the minerals under the earth, they belong to all Indians, not to just a minority. And in a sense, to have a social dividend, a basic income, is basically a compensation to those who've lost the commons. It's also a matter of compassionate justice, because it gives everybody an equal right. It's not charity. Charity, as David Hume taught us, is akin to contempt. An economic right is something that is important in itself. Finally, in terms of justice, it's a matter of ecological justice. The rich do most of the pollution. The poor bear the costs of pollution. And in a sense, a basic income is a compensatory payment because it's worth more for the poor than it is for the rich. And you can adjust it with taxes so that the rich don't actually benefit at all, but that's a political decision. And then finally, in terms of justice, it's a matter of work justice. I'm an economist, but I think it's a scandal that here we are in 2020, we still regard in our national statistics, in our economic accounts, in our rhetoric, in our textbooks, in our teaching, we regard unpaid care work as not work. It's a disgrace. So the work that we now regard as essential, suddenly regarded as essential in this pandemic, is not being paid or compensated. And in a sense, a basic income would enable people to spend more time doing unpaid care work and voluntary work and so on. I'll come back to that. The second ethical justification is something which I feel, as somebody who regards himself politically on the left, if you like, something that has been neglected by the left of the 20th century. And that is a basic income would enhance freedom. Freedom is very important, as we found in our pilots in India, in Africa, in Latin America, and in North America as well. The freedom that a basic income gives, first and foremost, is the freedom to say no. The freedom to say no to an oppressive relation, or oppressive landlord, or an oppressive employer. It's also the freedom to say yes. I would like to do more of that, if only I could afford to do more of that. And it's a matter of Republican freedom. Republican freedom is freedom from potential domination. A woman is not free if she has to ask her husband or her father if she can do something. However benevolent he might be, if she has to ask him, it's not real freedom. The freedom comes from being able to make that decision yourself. And we saw a lot of that in the course of the pilots. Of course, Gandhi put it rather nicely. I forget the exact words, I'm sure someone will tell me. But essentially he said, it's the freedom to look the other person in the eyes without having to give in to his will. That's Republican freedom. Now, basic income doesn't give total freedom, but it moves in the right direction, unlike most social policies which restrict freedom. And I think that in regard to freedom, I would say there's a vital policy rule. A social policy is just if it advances the freedom of the recipient rather than the discretionary power of the provider. I call this the rights, not charity principle. Every policy should have to pass that test. The basic income does that. I don't have time to go into the last point on freedom, but those of you who are economists would like to maybe tease your minds how this works out to be true. But with basic income, the emancipatory value is greater than the money value. Whereas with most social policies, it's the other way round. And that's partly to do with the fact that in most poor communities, the scarce commodity is money. And as we know, any commodity that is scarce, the price goes up. If you have an influx of basic incomes, you tend to force down the price of money. The only people who complained in the villages where we did the pilot, people used to joke about it when they came up and told us, were the money lenders, because they weren't doing so well. And the third ethical reason is that a basic income, almost by definition, would give people basic security. Basic security is a human need, not total security, but basic security. You can't function, you can't be rational if you don't have basic security. And basic security is a public good, and it's a superior public good, because the more people who have basic security, the greater the value of each of us having that basic security. And the psychologists have taught us, with experiments in many countries, that people who are insecure lose mental bandwidth. Their short-term IQ goes down. Anybody who has experienced chronic insecurity knows that feeling. So basic security is fundamental, it's an ethical matter. Now, if I can turn from the ethical justifications to the economic case, I think it's important to start by framing the global economic system. Those of you who know economics know that back in the 1980s, with Thatcher and Reagan, an ideology of neoliberalism, Washington's consensus, took off. But gradually, what happened was that this morphed into global rentier capitalism, where more and more of the income and wealth is flowing to the owners of assets, property, physical, financial, and intellectual property. And the labor share has been all over the world, dramatically declining all over the world. And in that context, a new global class structure, about which I've written several books, one was mentioned earlier, has taken shape with a plutocracy, an elite, a salariat doing quite well. Many of them will be listening in this webinar. A growing precariat underneath, living bits and pieces lives, feeling like they're supplicants, not having an identity or a narrative to give to their lives. And there are millions and millions of people who have drifted into the precariat. And whereas we had the Great Transformation, a term developed by Karl Polanyi in a famous book of 1944, which was a period dominated by financial capitalism, and had a crisis period, and then had to have new systems of social protection, distribution, and regulation. We've now reached a point of crisis in the global transformation, where the essence of it is that a crash was waiting to happen. By chance, my latest book came out in March. It was written last year. And basically the thesis of the book is that rentier capitalism had generated 8 modern giants. And this was drawing on an imagery that William Beveridge, in his famous epoch-defining report of 1942, had said. He said on page 2 that this is a time for revolutions, not catching. And it is a time to slay 5 giants. His 5 giants were disease, ignorance, idleness, squalor, and want. My argument is that modern rentier capitalism had generated 8 modern giants, which are threatening all of our societies, blocking the road to a good society. I believe that with respect to all 8, a basic income can help. Again, it won't get rid of all their strength, but it would help deal with those 8 giants. The first 8 of them is inequality. We have grotesque levels of inequality in the world, and wealth inequality is much, much greater than income inequality, and wealth relative to income has been growing, and a growing percentage of wealth around the world is inherited wealth. And in that context, we see that the wealth inequality in India has got to the point where the top 10% have 80% of the wealth, and you have 119 billionaires whose wealth is greater than your whole national budget. It's become a grotesquely unequal society. And I'm looking in as a friendly outsider, have always been saddened that the policymakers of diverse parties have not confronted the inequality that is there. If a basic income were introduced, it would help reduce inequality. And it would also address the demand shock that this pandemic represents. And it will do so in a progressive way because it will increase the propensity to consume and the consumption capacities of vulnerable groups in societies who have the highest average propensity to consume. So for me, inequality is something that has to be reduced because not only is it evil in itself, but it induces the strengthening of subsequent giants. And the second giant is insecurity. We have a pandemic of insecurity around the world, which is mainly, but not totally, a matter of what's called radical uncertainty. Unknown unknowns. It's not like what Beveridge was trying to deal with, contingency shocks, where you actuarially could calculate the probabilities of things happening and then have a social insurance system. With today's insecurity, it's about uncertainty. And uncertainty is a real pandemic, and we need to think of how do we put a floor under the level of uncertainty. The third giant is something that India knows as well as anywhere in the world, but if there's any consolation, it is just as great in the United States or in Britain or in any country I can think of as in India, and that is debt. we have a horrendous problem of private and corporate debt that is greater than at any time in human history. One of the reasons why the Spanish flu in 1918 and 1920 didn't have the same economic slump immediately afterwards, even though it resulted in many more deaths, probably 50 million deaths, was that private debt and corporate debt were much, much lower. Today, rentier capitalism thrives on private debt. And here we have a situation where more and more people are going to be tipped into homelessness, into suicides, and so on. I don't need to add to that story, you know it. But it leads to the fourth giant. The fourth giant is stress. Again, we have horrific levels of stress recorded in medical surveys, social surveys, economic surveys, which results in premature deaths, suicides, deaths of despair, a rising level of morbidity, and a susceptibility to be vulnerable to pandemics and aftermaths. Stress is something that goes with the other elements, but it is a separate thing, and it causes a lot of internal and societal problems. The fifth giant may not appear quite the same level in India today, but is precarity. The sense that more and more people in more and more societies are losing the rights of citizenship. They're losing the capacity to feel that they have social rights, they have economic rights, they have cultural rights. They feel like supplicants. For me, that is the key defining issue of being in the precariat. Not you have unstable labor, that's obvious, but that you feel like a supplicant. You feel undignified as a person. The sixth is the robots. I get invited to speak about this in Silicon Valley. I don't believe that it's going to make us all redundant, but the robots clearly are disruptive. They're increasing the inequality. They're increasing the rentier income flowing to the plutocrats and to plutocratic corporations. And if we had a better economic system, then we should be able to welcome automation and the robots. It's the seventh giant, which in the book I said could be, should be, the tipping point where I believe a majority of people will suddenly feel that a basic income system is a necessary part of the transformation. And that is the threat of extinction. Extinction is something that's affecting not only global warming, disappearing species, but is actually now shown that the ecological damage that we've been doing collectively through our economic models often has been creating more and more conditions that are susceptible for viruses spreading from animals to humans. We must remember that this pandemic that we're experiencing today is already the sixth pandemic this century. It's never happened to the same extent, a sequence, and there will be others coming down the road. We are living in a time of pandemics. Now, what we have a situation is that extinction and global warming require huge tax reform. They require us to phase out completely energy subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, not partially, but totally. They require us to have a decently high carbon tax and eco taxes, but by themselves, those are regressive. In other words, if you've just introduced them and did nothing else, that would tend to increase inequality because the low income person will be paying proportionately more. And that is why it is essential that when they are introduced, you recycle the revenue gains in the form of basic income dividends. There are ways that you can do that, which I explained in my Commons book in particular. The extinction issue is also a matter of how we spend our time, how we use our time. One of the beauties of a basic income is it says you can spend more of your time caring for your loved ones, caring for your community, doing voluntary ecological work, less resource depleting labor, and more resource preserving work. That is something that we need to do to tilt the balance of the way we spend our time. And I think it's in a good way and a productive way and an ecologically sustainable way. And the eighth giant is one that I've been worrying about in the Precariat books and elsewhere for many years, and that's the risk of neo-fascist populism. We've seen it. We see it with Donald Trump. We see it with other characters strutting the stage in Europe and elsewhere, whereby they play on the fears. They play on xenophobia. They play on the other being the cause of your problems. They're doing it successfully, and we can only confront that by giving people the security that they feel they belong to the system that's being developed. For me, the eight giants are together. A basic income system's not going to slay any of them, but it's going to weaken the threat of all of them and help. That leads to the final few remarks I want to make, supplementing what Renana said earlier. You're listening to a man who has a strange habit of being involved in pilots of basic income in 4 continents and having analyzed and worked with others on other pilots. And even though there are different designs, even though a lot of methodologically purists, people say there's this defect, that defect, they're only short term, etc., etc. What is remarkable is that the findings from all of the pilots are consistent with one another. Let me just highlight a few of them. First of all, with basic income pilots, you see quite quickly an improvement in health, particularly in the reduction of small illnesses and the recourse to medical care. One of the wonderful things that we saw in the pilots in Madhya Pradesh is that people who had common sicknesses were taking their antibiotics and other medicines to completion, whereas before they tried to save money and only started to take them as soon as they started to feel better, they stopped. But it also has been shown in Canada, a wonderful pilot was done there, that it results in far fewer people needing to go for hospital treatment and therefore saving on public health. All these studies that I've seen show that having a basic income reduces stress. It makes people feel more in control of their time, more in control of themselves. That's been shown in a recent pilot in Finland and another one in Canada. Another finding which is common is that school attendance rates go up, particularly of girls. This is what we found, this is what others have found, this is what we've seen in Africa as well. And not only attendance goes up, but performance goes up. Of course, that means that your public resources in schooling are being used more efficiently, more equitably, because the people who really benefit are those who are from insecure families and so on. So their gain tends to be relatively greater. Another finding that we found, and we found elsewhere, is that a basic income, contrary to the critics, results in more work, not less. I repeat that because prejudice continues. It results in more work, not less, and more productive and cooperative work. One of the findings that we've seen is it results in more people doing secondary economic activities, as well as more care work. The only groups that you see a reduction in work is children. Well, you can't have everything. They're spending more time in school. Besides the work issue, we've also seen that it results in increased production. And this is an economic argument for which you cannot possibly make with regard to the PDS or Narega or whatever, because it induces more production, it induces multiplier effects, it induces a better atmosphere for investment and for pooling, so that more spending on small-scale productive activities takes place. Now, I just would like to make Renana smile. I always spend my life trying to make Renana smile by reminding her of one of the little findings that we had in the villages in Madhya Pradesh. We suddenly found that there was a multiplication of goats in the basic income villages. And what was happening, of course, is that families were using, I succeeded, she's just smiled, so that's good. What we were seeing is that individual families bought a goat, and the goats were meeting around the corner, and suddenly there were many goats. So there was a supply of milk and meat in the villages. You can't get that if you give a sack of stale paddy and rations. You don't get that sort of effect. And I think it's important that all pilots have shown that even if it's a modest amount, even if it's say 40%, 50% of subsistence, which is hardly a vast amount, I would propose now, but it could be debated, that it should be 1,000 rupees a month, 500 rupees for children. But even if it was a modest amount, people start to gain control of their finances and pay down their debts and increase their savings and have better responses when they're hit by a shock. Borrow from relatives, they can help each other, and it gives that greater resilience. Micro level resilience translates into macro level resilience. Now, for me, the paying of basic income is a relatively easy matter. A country like India spends a vast percentage on unproductive subsidies that only increase inequality. They don't help with markets. They help with privileges. Governments have been spending money very much like confetti. I think we need an emergency basic income, but in the longer term, we need to build capital funds along the idea of sovereign wealth funds, democratically controlled, separate from government, so they can't be politicized. And I think that we should realize that every country, because of rentier capitalism, because wealth inequality has become so grotesque, has to have a modest wealth tax. They have to have a modest inheritance tax. It's fundamentally unfair and economically bad to allow this trend of wealth inequality to continue without some fiscal measures to respond to it. Now, I'd like to end by saying that the last mile issue, as we call it, how do you roll it out? How do you do it in practice? I'd like to remind you that when we did the pilots, Sonia Gandhi herself told us that it couldn't be done because they didn't have bank accounts in the rural areas. Within 2 months, 96% of the people have been able to open bank accounts. Today, with mobile money, it's much, much easier, identification cards, etc. To get this introduced, I believe a government should be advised to solicit the involvement of the intermediary organizations to help introduce it, to facilitate the spread of it. Now, if I get the word right, Atmania data, I should do better than that. Essentially, government has been talking about self-reliance. Self-reliance starts with the individual. It starts with everybody out there. A basic income would strengthen self-reliance and resilience. I'll end with the quotation, an aphorism from Confucius. Confucius said, "The easiest way out is through the door." Why is it that so few people take that route? Basic income is that door. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. That was very inspiring, as well as give us so much information. And while you were speaking, lots and lots of questions came. And I think I apologize to people whose questions I won't take up, only because partly my own inability to manage all the questions. I've tried to group some of the questions, and the first one, which you can expect and which you get everywhere, is that of affordability. So we have a lot of people asking about affordability. We have somebody from South Africa, Moses Mikwabe. We have Aditya Krishna, who says, if you talk about UBI, but we have a debt GDP ratio in India, which is more than 70%. Can we afford it? We have Sudhir Jain, who's asking where the resources will come from. Sorry. And we have Harish Chandra, who did a back of the envelope calculation and found it was a huge amount. Beena Agarwal is also asking, especially about the affordability. And I'm sure there are others. I may excuse us if I don't name them. So let me just give you 3 questions. There are lots more, so you can expect more in the second round. So the first, of course, is the affordability question. The second type of question is about barriers to UBI in India. So what are, again, Beena is asking about potential obstacles. Others are asking barriers. Rahul Pal has pointed out to certain groups of people who don't have, who are homeless or don't have Aadhaar cards. How would you reach them? Similarly, let me see who else. Somebody else asked, oh yes, KK Somashankaran said, well, a lot of people don't have bank accounts. How would you reach them? So the whole issue of obstacles. So that's the second type of question. The third type of question, which I'll put to you, is you're talking about income inequality will decrease, but in India, one of the big issues is social inequality. So among castes, among men and women. So Navdeep Singh says, in his studies, he's found that even when women have good earnings, they are subject to the will of their husbands. Dinesh Avasthi has specifically asked, what about the social inequalities? Somebody else has also pointed out an experiment in Telangana where the World Bank talks about resilience, but in fact, all it does is actually increase the caste-based social inequality. So how do you combine? I mean, is there any way basic income will be addressing social inequalities, or are we just talking about income inequality? So those are 3 questions. You might want to get to them. You're muted, Guy.
I think there are more than 3 questions, Renana, so I will try and address the general spirit. You're muted, I can't hear you now, but let me start with the
affordability, there's the obstacles.
Yeah.
And then there is
I get the idea.
So it's
I get the idea. Look, I think as the first point on affordability, there are a number of ways of breaking this down into sub-questions. The first thing is to say we are dealing with the emergency now, and there's a longer term building of a new income distribution system. The affordability issue is different for those two challenges. Okay, I think that's an important starting point. I think governments are not like households. I disagree with the IMF orthodoxy that somehow if you spend public spending, it crowds out private spending. On the contrary, public spending, if it's properly designed, can crowd in private spending, private investment, and more sustainable forms of growth. In a sense, I believe that if you've got a demand shock of the level we have it in all over the world now, governments have got to go into deficit spending, and they've got to use the money instead of quantitative easing for the banks, where they hand out, as they have done in the past, and they have done already, billions of dollars, euros, whatever it might be, into the financial sector to enable them to become even wealthier. We've got to have a more sensible way of spending, quantitative easing for people, if you like. And that, I think, could be the base for an emergency basic income, and that I support. In terms of the longer term affordability, I think we do need, in India as much as anywhere else, including South Africa, I was talking in South Africa last week, we need to have tax reform. We need to shift from taxing income, earned income, to taxing wealth and bads. And that would enormously increase the fiscal space for paying out a basic income. Subsidies in India are notoriously large, they're notoriously regressive. We found that there are thousands, not hundreds, not dozens, there are thousands of schemes involving payments from government, central or state governments, that never reach the people. They should be reformed. They don't function remotely, but they take up a lot of resources. And I believe that we should build what I call commons funds. I like what they're doing in Goa. My friend Raul Basu and his colleagues are looking at the ability to say minerals belong to all of us. And the capital value of minerals should be preserved, and therefore the extraction income should be built into a fund which, as it builds, can be paying out dividends. And I want to make the critical point here that the essence of any productive, progressive policy is to be on the road, be going towards it. Not saying we can't get there, therefore we can't do it, but to say we must get there, okay, we're going to build, we're going to build, we're going to build, we're going to mobilize the funds, we're going to build it. The same with the Norwegian pension fund. Today, every single Norwegian is a multi-millionaire because of their fund. But when it started, it didn't look like anything. The same with the Alaska Permanent Fund when that started, but now pays out a good basic income. Should do it. It's been badly managed recently, but it has done over the years. So for me, we should be thinking about carbon taxes. We need carbon taxes. We need to have market signals which say, if you create bads and pollute the atmosphere and pollute people and create the circumstances where viruses will spread and we'll have more pandemic slumps where the costs will be much, much greater, then we've got to move in the direction of having eco-taxes. And the eco-taxes can only function well if they are paid into a fund and then paid out as equal dividends as the value of the fund increases. It's no brainer in terms of the concept. There are more than 60 80 now, sovereign wealth funds that have that sort of principle. And India can have definitely stronger capital funds in which paying out of dividends would take place. But if you start with a wealth tax, if you start with having an inheritance tax, it is obscene that you have hundreds of millions of people in destitution, in chronic insecurity, and you have 119 multi-billionaires whose total wealth is worth more than the whole national budget. There's something fundamentally wrong there, both ethically and economically. So I feel that the affordability issue is really a political question, not an economic question. Can it be done? Yes. How should it be done? That's a political judgment. But I believe the question that should be asked now, I do this provocatively, but can India afford not to have a basic income system? It's the same with South Africa, and I'm very pleased that the government is considering it there and in other countries as well. The second set of questions refer to the obstacles. We found, as Renana knows and I know, that the obstacles to implementation are not that great. The native intelligence of poor people is not low, or no lower than your or mine. They're merely poorer. And they can work out what actions to take. That's why we saw this rapid increase in getting bank accounts, helped by SAWA, but without huge costs. Where nobody, when they're making this complaint about basic income implementation, mentions that most of the schemes that exist in India are far worse in those terms than you'd have with a basic income system. Just go out in the villages and watch how the PDS has been working, and you wonder how on earth people could have faith in it. Some places it seems to work better than others, but I've not seen it working well. For me, the interesting issue, and our mutual friend Sarath Devala and I have proposed, that it would be a really sensible thing to have a pilot in tribal areas, because we saw when we did a basic income pilot in tribal areas that the positive impacts, feedback effects, almost pays for itself. And that, I think, is something that should be taken into account. The third set of questions relate to social inequalities. It's a very good question. I salute it, and I'm happy to answer it, because everywhere we have done pilots, we found that the people who've gained most are the most disadvantaged in those communities. The untouchables gain tremendously. We saw in one village, I remember, that to start with the hostility of upper caste people towards us giving to the least, the most disadvantaged, was very hostile. But after it started to work, they suddenly realized that the solidarity of the total community was improving, and the benefits were visible and tangible. It's the same with disability. We have a wonderful story. It's on the front page of our book, because when I saw this picture, I wanted it because it's such a beautiful story. This woman has no legs, and at the beginning of the pilot, she was the most disadvantaged in her family. She got the last of the food, the last of the medical attention, the last of the treatment. But as soon as she had her own individual basic income, she became a full member of the family. And as a full member of the family, with greater respect and helped by the others, by the end of the pilot, there she is with her sewing machine. She'd become the village seamstress. And when I tell this story, I break down, but it's beautiful. For me, it helps those who need help most, even though it is given to everybody. You can tax back from the wealthy, so don't say why give to the wealthy or not. It's much easier to do it this way. You reach more people than if you try means testing or proxy means testing or behavioral conditions, which allow the panchayats and the others to use their power and deny the vulnerable, most vulnerable benefits. So for me, it is a good story. It is something that justify having pilots that are rolled out, starting in areas of greatest deprivation. But I think that by itself, it reduces social inequalities, and that is crucial. I apologize if I haven't answered all the questions that Renana put, but I've tried.
Thank
You're
you, guys.
muted.
And I've just been sorting through the many new questions which have come. I will try, and maybe I put, instead of 3, since we're now going close to the time, I'll sort of go over 2 questions, but they're quite questions with many parts in them. I apologize for not using people's names. Now I've kind of grouped their questions. So there are issues around basic income, and what people think may be some of the negative aspects of having a basic income. So we have increased dependency on the government. We have, will they start being less employed? Will they work less? Then, of course, will they have socially harmful behavior, liquor, etc.? Will it lead to inflation? Demand will suddenly go up, supply may not be there. Will it lead to inflation? And then we have some interesting questions around politics. Bina has said that what she was talking about was political obstacles. And another question says, well, will politicians let it happen? Because if it becomes a right, then they will lose their ability to manipulate people. So there's a whole range of questions around the negative issues. The second one is, again, a range of questions. People are asking, well, what about the rich? If it's a national social dividend, will the rich also access it? And should they be accessing it? So those are 2 questions. And if we have time, I'll bring in more.
Okay, let me try and answer the spirit of those questions. First of all, it's rude of me to say this, but all the questions that have come up, I think I can honestly say are covered in my book, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. It's a Penguin book, and it was designed to do a review of based on 30 years of work by myself and talking, and listening, and so on. So the questions that have been raised, I hope are dealt with at length in that book. I believe they are. Let me take a few of the points here. Increased dependency on government. I think that is the bureaucratic Raj has been so powerful over the last 70 years, and it gives local politicians and local bureaucrats enormous power to turn citizens into dependents. I think a PDS subsidy scheme is really making the poor dependent on sacks of stale paddy being delivered in a ration shop. And you have to travel long distances, and you have to queue, and you have to travel again because there wasn't any stuff there. This system is inducing a sense of dependency. I am dependent on the PDS supplying my food, even though I may not like that food. The same with public works things. You are creating a dependency. I would much prefer that commercial public works roads, bridges, everything were done on a proper commercial basis and people were paid proper wages and so on. Because otherwise you are making the poor dependent. That is dependency. The essence of a basic income system is that you have it as a right, an economic right. It's non-withdrawable. You can't take it away from me unless I've done something that's contrary to the law. You can't take it away from me. So I'm not dependent on you. And I very carefully said that the implementation of a basic income should be handled by an institution that is democratically and separate from the government of the day. Now that will take courage. That will take courage from the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance. That will take courage from all politicians. And they're not known for a lot of courage. And I'm arguing from an ethical and economic point of view, we have to be putting pressure on those politicians, those bureaucrats, to reduce dependency. I'll come back to that just in a second, because I think the other arguments that were made, we've dealt with. One of the things that we found very surprising in Madhya Pradesh was that we collected data on alcohol and tobacco consumption and consumption of other things, and consumption of alcohol and tobacco went down. At the time, we even doubted our data, but there's now been a World Bank study from surveys from all over the world, is that people who, once they have some basic security, actually start consuming other goods and spending their time doing other things. So in a sense, as we economists call it, tobacco and alcohol at that level are inferior goods. People spend things on more productive activities. And as far as inflation is concerned, I've got a good story to tell there too. Demand increases supply. It's basic economics. Except in rare cases, if you increase demand, aggregate demand, in other words, people have more money to spend, they want to buy basic goods and services, and that induces increased supply. And the increased supply with economies of scale leads to higher profits from production. What we found, again, not only in India, but in Africa and in Latin America, that actual unit prices went down after a year or two of the pilot, but profits went up because they were selling more. And one of the things I found really fascinating in Africa, with one of our pilots, was that one of the reasons production increased and prices went down is that economic crime went down. People were less desperate and therefore didn't steal the animals and the food, the vegetables from their neighbors. And therefore the neighbors felt more confident that they could produce more because they would have more at the end of it. And it induced a virtuous cycle. So the skeptics, the cynics who talk about inflation are really dealing with one-handed economics. They think adding demand, prices must go up, but they ignore the supply side. And the supply side, the supply elasticity has been shown to be very, very strong. I think that's except the last question, the last point raised in the last round, as it were. Politicians have spaghetti backbones, mostly. They don't have a lot of courage, but some are out of the box. We have to find those people, we have to support those people and let them set the beacon. I want to tell a story which is in the book Basic Income, in the last book, How We Make It Happen, about a group of people who went to see Roosevelt in the White House. And they were advocating a particular policy. And he listened and he asked them questions over 40 minutes. And then he said, okay, You've convinced me. Now go out into the street and force me to do it. I think today, all around the world, we're at that stage. Huge majorities in opinion polls across Europe are now in favor of basic income. The same in the United States, the same in Japan. I hope that it will grow and grow in India and elsewhere. And as that popular demand grows and as the need grows, I think we'll see more young politicians, more women in particular, coming out and saying, we will do it. And in one state, one country does it, there will be a domino effect. I hope I'm around to watch it. Now,
did you talk about the rich people getting and should they be getting basic income?
I'd like to say I'll respond to that. I didn't answer that. My belief is that a basic income should be given to every usual resident. It is a right. It is an economic right, not a charitable act. It's not specifically anti-poverty. It's for a different income distribution system. But if you've noticed, I'm also advocating tax policies to help pay for it, which would be predominantly borne by the wealthy. So in effect, they would not gain by it. I'll tell you a story. We did a pilot in Namibia. And when we were distributing the first basic income payments, the first month's payments to all the villagers, a rich farmer came down in a 4x4 and he got out with his long socks, I remember, short trousers, and he strode across to me and said, why are you giving me a basic income? I don't need a basic income. And I said to him, well, look, you are a member of the community. You are a member of this community, and you therefore qualify. If you wish to give it away or you wish to deal with it otherwise, that's your prerogative, but you are a member of this community, are you not? And interestingly, a few months later, that man became the strongest possible advocate of a basic income in Namibia, because he understood that it strengthens community. He understood that it strengthens the sense of social solidarity. We've seen that again and again and again. People pool their money to look after sanitation problems. They pool their money to help others, to improve the local school or whatever it might be. But it strengthens that sense of solidarity. And this pandemic is creating a need for social solidarity to be vastly strengthened, not on the old basis of patriarchal extended family situations, but communities of like-minded people who want to build and develop and involve their neighbors, involve their friends, preserve the species, have a sensible, quieter life, less stress. This is all part of a transformation that we need to encourage. And I think that is what the basic income debate is about.
Priyanka, can I have one more question? I don't have much to say at the end, so.
Yeah, one round you can have. We have 7 minutes.
All right.
We have 7 minutes, ma'am. So.
Guys, that all right? Let me just ask you, two questions. One is, again, people are really skeptical about whether in India, and the kind of the issues are, well, you would have to raise taxes, and how would you overcome resistance to, say, taxing wealth? In India, we have a really good track record of corruption and inefficiency. So won't that affect the UBI also? So those are the skeptics or people who know the Indian system and worry about it. But I want to ask an international question that somebody put, which is, what about the ex-socialist countries in Europe and Asia? Can they have a basic income? What do you think? And I think we have less than 5 minutes. So for all that, you have like 3 minutes to answer.
I think the first question on taxing wealth, I strongly believe that there's a sea change taking place among the super rich of the world. Not everyone, not all of them. I, strangely enough, being the sort of person I am, very strangely, I've been asked to speak 3 years running at Davos, which is the elite place for all the corporates and so on. And I've also been asked to speak in Silicon Valley. And while most of them are among the wealthiest people in the world, there has been a realization that they know the economic system is rigged in their favor, and they know that it's unsustainable. They know that there are going to be more economic crashes, more pandemics with this model that has been built up, and there's going to be a higher probability of more politicians like Donald Trump being elected to create havoc and worsen what we're all experiencing. And they may be super rich, and therefore most of us feel difficult, hard to relate to them and feel a lot of sympathy with them, etc. But they're not stupid. And many of them have come round and spoken out, actually explicitly, saying what the wealthy must pay more taxes. We must be taxed more. I was very impressed that a group of 25 multi-billionaires issued a statement 10 days ago or something like that, saying precisely that. And I've been invited to the India Today conclave, where I've met some very wealthy Indians, and Renana knows we've discussed possible support for basic income pilots with some of them. And I'm impressed that they realize the system is just too rigged. It's one thing to be earning high incomes and have high wealth, but it gets to obscenity, and it means that the society underneath you is more and more fragile. And they're realizing that. So I think there's a sea change taking place, and I'm seeing it in Europe and elsewhere as well. As far as the corruption is concerned, again, I would say, look, we know the existing systems of selective, targeted, means-tested, conditional, subsidies, and all of that complexity is conducive to horrendous levels of corruption. We know it. What you've got to do is ask, if you had the simplicity of a basic income paid directly to individuals in some way, with a card or something like that, or mobile money, you cut out a large number of layers where corruption takes place. I believe with the clogged pipes are so strong with the existing system that multiplies corruption, perpetuates corruption, is very regressive. And a basic income system is by itself more transparent. It's less conducive to corruption. And it's much more efficient, it's more equitable. And as we've seen with the pilots, it results in much better behavioral reactions, economic reactions, which have feedback effects and help with fiscal challenges. I think a government that is brave enough to introduce something like it will prove to be very popular very quickly. And I think that the corruption would actually fall considerably. But it won't be perfect. I'm not going to pretend that you still won't have challenges, but I say to a skeptic, a cynic, this is a much better system in terms of transparency and equity and efficiency than what's been there for many, many years.
Okay. I think we are running out of time, or we have run out of time. And thank you, Guy, for answering all these many questions. I wish I could pose some more. There's a whole another list, but maybe for another time. And you said everything that I could possibly have said at the end. And so I will just end with thanking you so much. And also thanking all the people who've sent in their 99 plus questions. And I also would like to especially thank Professor Alak Sharma and Ms. Priyanka Tyagi for this webinar, as well as for conducting it. Can I hand it over back to you, either of you?
Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, ma'am. And thank you so much, Professor Guy Standing. This has been such an enriching and a very engaging lecture. And thank you to all the attendees for engaging with us. We had around 386 people at a time who joined us on Zoom, and there were many more on YouTube as well. And we tried to post questions here as well. So I understand we could not take all the questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a compendium of questions, download it, and share it with, of course, Professor Guy Standing. I'm sure he'll be able to, answer most of them. And thank you so much, Ms. Renana Chawala, for moderating it and for doing this for us. Thank you so much. And just a few thank yous, because I have a big team which helps us do all this, organize the webinar. So I would like to name Aditi for our social media dissemination, and Daniel from our communication team, who is with us, who assists us in organizing this webinar. Then we have Arzu for our branding, and then we have Wahid, Fatima, and Nisar for our e-dissemination, the electronic dissemination through emails and designing the emailer and others. And from our office, we have Vijay Lal, we have Vikas, we have Jyoti Girish, and of course, all of us. Together, we work under one person, under supervision of and guidance of one person, that is Professor Alak Sharma, who leads us from the front. So thank you so much. And yes, as I said, I'll share all the questions with you sooner. Please, to all the attendees, please do stay connected. The YouTube link will be available very shortly on our YouTube channel, that is IHT India. And we will put it up on Facebook as well. And also, you can be updated about our previous webinars. All the videos are available on our website, that is www.ihtindia.org. And of course, this one will definitely be there. And we'll disseminate the link of this webinar also to all the attendees and then the registrants. And finally, I've been getting a lot of questions about the attendance certificates. Very shortly, all the attendees and participants will be getting the attendance certificates. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Guy Standing, Ms. Renana Chawala, Professor Alak Sharma. And to all the attendees, stay connected with us. We will be coming up with more under this series. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Renana ji.
Thank you. Thank you.